Hello and welcome to Moments in History. I'm Linda Shenton-Matchett, author, speaker, and history geek. While researching my stories, I unearth tons of intriguing historical information that does not end up in my books. So I've created this channel to share those tidbits with you, and I really appreciate you stopping by. Victory in Europe Day, also known as VE Day, occurred 80 years ago this month. It's the day celebrating the formal acceptance by the Allies of Germany's unconditional surrender of its armed forces. On the Eastern Front, the last known shots were fired on May 11th, and the Battle of Odzak between Yugoslavian and Croatian troops ended on May 25th. Hitler had died by suicide on April 30th during the Battle of Berlin, and the surrender was authorized by his successor, Reichspräsident Karl Donitz. His administration is known by several names, most commonly the Flensburg government, because the cabinet had relocated to Flensburg in northern Germany. On May 4th, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery met with a German delegation at Lüneburg Heath, east of Hamburg, where he accepted their unconditional surrender of German forces in the Netherlands, northwest Germany, and Denmark. Two documents were signed. The first occurred at 2:41 a.m. on May 7th in the SHAEF headquarters at Reims by German Colonel Alfred Jodl, surrendering all forces to Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower. The second, slightly modified document was insisted upon by Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, and that was signed by German Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at 10:43 p.m. on May 8th in Berlin, and is considered the definitive German instrument of surrender. Both men were ultimately found guilty of war crimes during the Nuremberg trials and executed. Late on May 7, the announcement of the war's end in Europe was broadcast to the British people, and the BBC interrupted its scheduled programming to notify the public that Victory in Europe Day would be a national holiday and take place the following day. Newspapers ran headlines as soon as they could, and special editions were printed. Unsurprisingly, the news spread like the proverbial wildfire. By all reports, many of the British people did not wait for the official day of celebration to begin their festivities after 6 long years of restrictions, blackouts, and bombing raids. Red, white, and blue bunting and flags were hung all over the country, and bonfires were lit. Pubs and the streets were filled with citizens. On VE Day, King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace in front of massive crowds. The royal family made a total of 8 appearances on the balcony, and Churchill headed to Whitehall where he addressed another large crowd. During the last appearance by the King and Queen, the princesses had been given permission to mingle incognito with the crowds. Elizabeth would say many years later, "We stood outside and shouted, 'We want the king!' I think it was one of the most memorable nights of my life." Midday, both the King and Churchill gave national radio broadcasts, with the King saying, "Let us remember those who will not come back. Let us remember the men in all the services, and the women in all the services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of rejoicing." Churchill reminded listeners of the war still raging in Japan, saying, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued." In England, celebrations continued well into the night with singing, dancing, and drinking, as licensing hours had been extended until midnight. President Harry Truman broadcast at 9 a.m. and reminded Americans victory was only half won. Flags were still at half-mast, honoring the 30-day mourning period for President Roosevelt, who had passed away on April 12th. Truman dedicated the victory to FDR's memory and ordered flags to remain at half-mast, saying he wished Roosevelt had lived to witness the victory. Celebrations occurred throughout the United States, and New York City's Times Square was especially jammed with people. Some towns celebrated in more somber means by attending church services, and many employees remained at work, aware the war still raged in the Pacific. In Paris, crowds filled the center of the city in celebration, One source was quoted as saying, "On the Champs-Élysées they were singing 'It's a Long Way to Tipperary,' and in the Place de Toile there was hardly any place to breathe and no place at all to move." Close to the war in the Pacific, Australia's response was restrained, as many of their young men and women were still serving overseas. Unfortunately, riots broke out in Halifax, Canada, among the military personnel stationed there. Thousands of soldiers, sailors, and civilians looted liquor stores which had closed for VE Day, and several deaths are attributed to the riots. French Algeria was also the site of violence. Muslims celebrating the end of the war and protesting for independence became targets and were massacred by colonial authorities and settler militias. To this day, Britain continues to commemorate VE Day, as do Austria, France, Germany, Poland, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Since 2015, Russia has celebrated National Victory Day on May 8. Prior to that day, from 1945 to 1990, the National Day of Victory and Freedom was commemorated on the 9th. After the fall of the Soviet Union until 2015, no commemorations occurred. Belgium honors both wars on November 11th, Armistice Day, held in the King's presence at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. It would be another 3 months before Japan agreed to surrender, with the document not signed until September 2nd, 1945. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. If you'd like to learn even more history, please stop by my blog, which is found on my website at www.lindashentonmatchett.com. And please consider subscribing to my YouTube and or Spotify channels, Moments in History, to see and hear new episodes that generally release on the second and fourth Fridays of each month. Click the bell icon in YouTube to be notified of new episodes. Thank you for watching and have a great rest of your day.